So as a historical European martial artist, people always ask me, what about guns? First point is, there were more than just firearms to consider when it comes to projectile weapons. Knights, men-at-arms and other fighters would always be painfully aware of the fact that there were all kinds of projectile weapons to deal with that could end their life at a distance before they even got into close contact and engaged with the enemy. There were bows, crossbows, slings, javelins, ballistae, all sorts of problems. And that's not including the variety of things like siege defences that were employed to kill people before they could get in contact. And considering this, that's why you see things like higher quality armour, shields, and even certain weapon systems designed to get around these problems. So it's always worth bearing in mind that guns are not the be-all and end-all when it comes to projectile weapons. In history, firearms were some of the worst projectile weapons, except for the fact that they were cheap. Second point is, firearms have been around. It's not like knights didn't know about them, and indeed, they had counter-tactics for them. Firearms have been around, in Europe at least, ever since around the 1300s. You see the earliest versions known as the handgun or hand cannon. Quite simply, a scaled down version of a basic cannon with the tube, a touch hole, and then the person wielding it would have a fuse, light it off and shoot. And of course you see the guns developing then on into things like the arquebus, the matchlock musket, then you start seeing the flintlock technology, and that's when you start progressing on and on until we have the guns that we know and love today. Whereas back in those time periods, the firearms that were available, like the hand cannon and the arquebus, were very inferior. They were very inaccurate, they were slow to fire, and were typically used as a cheap weapon, and a weapon that's quite easy to train with, even easier than crossbows, for people like peasants, or even people like knights and men-at-arms, who needed to focus more on their close combat training and just needed a simple sidearm or a projectile weapon to engage with. There are various reasons why guns were used, but it wasn't because it just became the ultimate sort of weapon that owned the battlefield. It was simply a convenience along with every other type of weapon set and type of troop available. And bearing this in mind, again, there were even counter-tactics developed specifically against guns. We see from a Renaissance manuscript, I'll grab it from the internet for you, as you'll see now, there's basically a manuscript that actually shows explicitly how to deal with a firearm. So if you've got someone who's got a flintlock musket, sorry, a matchlock arquebus rather, wrong time period, he's got a matchlock arquebus, and you've got to make sure to get past them and close in, and it shows you need to do a zigzag pattern back and forth, and then once you've done that, you engage with them. And although that manuscript is shown in the Renaissance, so we're talking around the 1500s or 1600s, it still shows that people already knew of ways to deal with firearms before they had much of a chance to develop much. My final point is that quite often, especially when you look at things like the English Civil War, for example, which was around the 1640s, it actually shows that it was a necessity on the battlefield to have close combatants as well as people with guns. In those types of formations, you'd usually see what are called pike and shot. So rather than having separate troops like you'd see on certain video games consisting of things like archers, then infantry and then cavalry, you'd actually have mixed formations, with people using pikes and then people using muskets and arquebuses. Now, if you were considering pure firepower, then of course it would make sense to arm all your troops with muskets. Everyone universally armed with a firearm so the entire front line can shoot at once and mow down the enemy. So, why did they switch half of them or so to pikes? The simple answer is because of people like cavalry and others who could engage in close combat. When you've got people who can only use projectile weapons, it actually becomes a severe problem, because as soon as close contact is made, they end up basically dissolving. And a good example of this as well from another time period is the Zulu Wars. quite often, although the British had a superior firearms and were able to shoot and mow down all sorts of natives, the problem was, once close combat was reached, it became a severe problem, and usually it would become a victory to the other side. So that shows that actually, although firearms clearly are a useful projectile weapon, and they can be employed very effectively on a battlefield, if you entirely rely on them without having close combat as a backup, you end up in serious trouble. So going back to the pike and shot formations, we see that instead of having all the troops armed with firearms, you see that you've got almost a porcupine of spearmen keeping this protection around the gunners while they reload and shoot at will. So that wraps it up for today. Apologies, I've got a cheap air rifle instead of having an actual arquebus or musket, but if you're willing to donate on Patreon, that will help me to afford such things for future videos, and of course demonstrate them excitingly as well. But I still hope that you enjoyed the content anyway, and have a good day guys. Cheers!